Okay, this is going to kind of be maybe like a second installment of my comments on promoting Cape independence. So, and this might also just be sort of generically decent rhetoric for how to salvage the country or how to, or to some degree. I mean, I do think that there's a level of political commentary that is maybe missing, and I don't see people. The Daily Friend podcast, and which is made up from people who are part of the uh, man, I can't remember the first word. Oh my word. Something race relations. I don't know if it's not the Foundation for Race Relations, but it's oh my word. I can't remember the name of the organization. Uh, anyway, that famous NGO that does so much good work and that has always had quality people associated with it. Um, they're probably the closest to maybe echoing some similar sentiments of what I'm about to say, but maybe I would go too far to what they would be willing to do, especially being associated with any kind of organization. But so I made this argument in my sort of independent Cape argument, although I didn't maybe explicitly um, lay it out so succinctly and clearly that look, I mean, if the ANC government and politics is, I think, must be regarded as a crime against humanity, essentially. How the ANC governs and the politics that the ANC uses to govern is a crime against humanity. But this is a different kind of crime against humanity. Um, Maybe not that different from apartheid, but it is slightly different in that, I mean, certainly the noxious racialist policy that has been used by the ANC, and also the kind of the toxic racialist rhetoric and politics that has insulated the kind of corruption and mismanagement of the state. Anyway, this is what I'm talking about when I say crime against humanity, but it's a crime against humanity that is, if not endorsed, uh, is, through the principle that in a democracy the people are accountable for the government that it elects, um, that a large contingent of the electorate is responsible for or outright endorses the politics thereof. It's also a crime against humanity uh, that the Constitutional Court has colluded in. So a large contingent of the electorate and a large, and the Constitutional Court have colluded in this crime against humanity that I would say is basically represented by the politics and the government of the ANC. So I mean that's the overarching bottom line essentially, and under that I think that there are grounds to have a judicial revolution where you need to set up another constitutional court that can protect the constitution from the continuing damages that it is, from the ongoing delinquency of the state in its constitutional responsibilities and obligations and mandates. But essentially, the problem is that the jurisprudence itself is institutionally corrupted by disgusting things like the governmental prerogative, which was invented in order to justify government policy that cannot be justified, uh, to insulate and protect the politics of the ANC, which, as I said, should be largely seen as a crime against humanity, but at the very least, is fundamentally entrenched in maintaining and uh, uh, promoting a kind of democratic illiteracy in order to sustain the kind of support that the ANC enjoys. Um, that there's a concerted effort to keep parts of the country undeveloped in order to maintain a low information voting pool, but also a voting bloc that is susceptible to the kind of sort of tribalistic, racialist politics that the ANC, is constantly indulging in its two-faced way. While it still uses the word non-racialism, it overtly repudiates and betrays the value of non-racialism, as so does its policy and the law on the books, and this is even reflected in a now completely disfigured and dysfunctional jurisprudence in which the rights in the Bill of Rights are not being properly protected. The limitations clause is not being properly applied because of this invention of a governmental prerogative, these semantic tricks that are being played in order to stop the proper functioning of the constitutional order. This is part of the crime against humanity. That's probably a special crime against humanity that hasn't properly been invented yet, because in some sense the subversion of a constitutional order which was morally just and correct and right, it being distorted so as to facilitate corruption and mismanagement and sort of kleptocracy and all these sorts of things, and a kind of cynical politics as well, but also to curtail people using the courts to battle the government from its disgusting that the courts should have made itself amenable to facilitating taking control away from a government that was so delinquent in its constitutional responsibilities and mandates, but also what I also think is a problem is that should also say that certain departments in the academy have colluded in this crime against humanity. That the journalism department and the philosophy departments to some extent, but these new departments that have been created, sort of departments of race and gender studies, that these departments have created an anti-constitutional propaganda and laid the way for this disgusting racialist politics that can promote a kind of democratic illiteracy and sort of not make things about policy and principle, but and make things about actually dealing with reality, but instead dealing with the kind of the social psychology of how much pride your identity seems to have, and focusing everything towards rehabilitating a kind of racialist pride rather than actually fixing problems on the ground and fixing causes of problems instead of strange psychological symptoms that people seem to have, and these departments and journalism and court decisions that endorse the ham-fisted generalizations and racialism that is overtly in legislation, like the promotion of Equality Act, uh, which lays out, such a toxic form of affirmative action, um, such an unconstitutional form of affirmative action, um, that it sort of instills a disgusting sort of racialist consciousness, that it enforces on people in order just to actually understand how the law should work. You have to use people as tokens and dehumanize them and just see them for their color of their skin. It's so destructive in so many ways as well, because it makes credentials hollow. It means that things don't mean what they would otherwise commonly mean, because there are all these double standards all over the place, to facilitate what has been mandated by government. Um, and so we have markets that don't have proper signals. We have people that have essentially hollow credentials because they've had experience that they have never earned, or that they don't really have under their belt. It's all just a charade. It's all just a pretense. Imposter syndrome is a correct term for people who are made imposters by policy, by mandate, by government fiat. So we have a trust problem, as trust as a common societal trust has been displaced by an ideological indoctrination and subversion, that, well, don't look at them like an individual that doesn't have skills. Look at them like a token of a group that needs more racialist pride. And so you've got this fundamental mismatch that just creates a monstrosity of a situation that doesn't even deal with the core problem, doesn't actually put support where it's needed. It just gives people passes when they don't deserve to pass, instead of enabling them to pass by ameliorating some disadvantage or tackling the disadvantage or making up for the disadvantage, not in terms of fudging the outcome, but in terms of intervening and applying extra support along some step or something like that. So that there's no remedial activity that is done. It's only enforcing the pretense or the superficial, you know, the mirage of transformation, which then everyone has to believe is real. And therefore, if you say that it's hollow and it's not real, that then you're branded as perpetrating hate speech or something, because you're not getting along with the inhuman program that destroys trust in credentials or in human relations or in actual reality. You have to distrust reality and believe in the means are justified by the ends, and it'll all be fine at the end of the rainbow and unicorns and pixie dust. And it's anyway, so it's a fundamental psychological subversion in some sense, which also has very disgusting psychopathic incentives for opportunistic people to use this cultural program and this new set of values to parasitically exploit and sadistically get their hooks into people who aren't following this recipe, this conventional orthodoxy which has been imposed by government mandate. And so you've created a whole psychological market for people, and some of these people, are sort of famous. I think Van Damme in sorry, I don't know if I'm saying her name right, in the DA, sort of a famous identity politics driven individual who has, a personal record which is, laden with so many controversial, disgusting, conflagration and antagonism. That's what these people do, is they are opportunistic, psychopathic, sadistically edged vampires. And this kind of, these rules, this etiquette of identity politics gives them the perfect excuse to deploy their subjective relativism and indulge in creating moral obstacles for other people to kind of to trip over and to fall into the traps of not giving the correct appreciation and gratification to their subjective beliefs. That they don't have to actually negotiate a kind of trust out in the open. They just have to subjectively hold a belief, and somebody else has to guess their belief and appease it. It's sort of who can feel more offended and who has the conventional backup of the identitarian matrix of the grievance, who's on top of the grievance stack. It's anyways. So there's that whole aspect to it, and so we have, these celebrity psychopaths, who can complain on behalf of their whole representative faction, of their whole racialist identitarian group, because the more that they complain, the more compassion they're showing to that group of people. Of distribution that they're going to extract on behalf, and so that they can have bestowed on their identity. But it always gets bestowed on the identity and not on an individual. And so the individual never gets to access it. It never gets real, tangible empowerment of the individual. You only get empowered as an identitarian token, as an identity representative, which is a fundamental problem, because it means that you can't have your cake and eat it. It means that you end up disempowering yourself. And the only way that you can make up for that is by becoming more psychopathic and damaging people, going after people, and trying to vindicate your lack of authenticity by taking it out on somebody else, on finding an ideological scapegoat, a perpetrator to blame and put everything on. So that's kind of what we're living through now. And and the sad thing is that our legal framework, our constitutional order, should have allowed us to say, no, you can't teach identity politics in public universities. You don't have the academic freedom to generate anti-constitutional propaganda and racialist propaganda. You're fired. You're not getting public money for this. We should have been able to do that through the legal system. But because the legal system basically has institutionalized this critical race theory, has created the requisite fabricated tools like the governmental prerogative that shield them from actually properly attending to the limitations clause and saying that no, these things are unjustified encroachments and limitations of people's rights in the Bill of Rights, that we're not going to actually examine if the policy actually is worth its weight, is supposedly worth the trade-off in limiting, like what are we achieving for the limitation that we are perpetrating on other people's rights. Instead of making that, they don't say, oh no, we can't even make that weight. We can't even make that measure of that weight, of that trade-off, because there's a governmental prerogative. There's no mention of a governmental prerogative in the limitations clause. There is absolutely none. The constitutional court and the law itself has betrayed the Constitution. It's betrayed the individual rights in the Bill of Rights, which effectively mean that social justice has been destroyed, because when you treat people as a generalization, when you put people as a scapegoat for the system, that is the opposite of social justice. You have created the opposite of what the Constitution renders as social justice. You've created a mockery of it. You've created a mockery of moral language in order to justify semantically all of this bullshit that's gone on. And then this is exactly what's happened, is that words have been twisted. They have now, it's doublespeak. Things now mean their opposite. This new racism calls itself anti-racism, as it completely destroys and betrays the value of non-racialism. This is a kind of crime against humanity. I mean, obviously it's more obvious in terms of the immediate effects of what the government does, but it's this corruption of government, this corruption of the states and mismanagement of the states comes from the principled moral corruption. And if we don't make that link, that linkage, that the moral corruption is the cause, that the state corruption is the symptom of, and in some sense this means that also we have to indict our fellow citizens that have endorsed a government and policies that are part of this crime against humanity. And in some sense, again, under the auspice of needing a judicial revolution, because we need to have an authentic constitutional court to vindicate and protect the Constitution. And all these people who have conspired to reduce the rights in the Constitution, these people are criminals. The Constitution is the highest law in the land. You can amend the Constitution. You can't subtract from it. You can elaborate the Constitution. You can make it better by expanding it. You can't reduce the supreme law of the land. And conspiring to reduce rights in the Bill of Rights is a crime of committing constitutional damages, or trying to do that, because you don't have the power to do that. You can go through some procedure to change the Act of Parliament, but you can't change the people's document. I mean, again, this is another thing that needs to be vindicated by an authentic constitutional court. Amendment to the Constitution actually has to it has to have a qualitative degree of passing muster. I mean, another way of saying this perhaps is that, well, if you want to do this, I would argue two things: is that you can't say that you have a certain percentage in Parliament to amend the Constitution if you are representing less of the eligible electorate than you were in some earlier Parliament. So, as voter apathy has increased, your percentages should be reworked according to what the height of electoral participation was. That's just one, let's say, technical measure that you could do. But essentially, the growing democratic deficit, which I would argue is a direct result of the ANC's policy of keeping a kind of democratically illiterate populace in order to continue this charade of democratic constitutional government, when it's, I guess you could say that it's still democratic, but it's certainly anti-constitutional, and which has been facilitated by the corruption of the courts themselves or of the law in general, the institutional corruption of that. But that if you want to reduce a right in the Bill of Rights, you have to have at least 75%, because you are changing the nature of Section 1. You are redefining the nature of Section 1 implicitly. You can add things, but to reduce things, at the very least, you're changing the very nature of the foundational definitions, of the foundational values. You are messing with what those foundational values imply as they are um, as they are connected with the content of the Bill of Rights, Section 2. So if you are implicitly changing the nature of Section 1, then you have to have 75%. Anyway, so I mean, under these grounds, I think you can set up the necessity of two things. You need to establish a quorum of judges that are willing to participate in a judicial revolution and set up an independent constitutional court. And you need to redraw the boundaries of a territory that excludes um, territories that have a democratic endorsement of the ANC government or of, I mean, I would basically say the ANC and the EFF, um, which is essentially an ANC breakaway, but also essentially has the same ideological, substantive program of that endorses this kind of constitutional trickery, endorses this kind of semantic play, endorses democratic illiteracy in favor of a racialist sort of demagoguery. Um, and racialist policy. Uh, anyway, so yeah, I do think that essentially something like the South African Constitution is the only thing that can protect a society from the ravages of things like identity politics, which is essentially license for unaccountable politics. As soon as you have the opaque moral murkiness of doing things for reasons of generalization and generalized morality that's horribly reduced into token attributes like race. You never have to be accountable for actually empowering people, for actually combating and tackling disadvantage. You never actually have to focus on education because you can just kind of try to redistribute the outcomes and sort of parasitize people who do have skills and do have you end up creating a vampire economy instead of an actual ladder of development and empowerment. And so you're invested in all the wrong things. You have all the wrong kinds of governmental um, programs. Anyway, and a court system that is willing to police these things and in some sense to put some pressure to bear, at least when the government is trying to implement policy that is limiting other people's rights, that then it should be worth it should be worth its weight, it should be worth its cost, and it should be tested through the courts, where it's not anymore because of this invention of this governmental prerogative. So, I mean, all of these things, it is absolutely necessary to have a constitutional court that's actually functioning, that is actually fit for purpose, that is actually willing to do this function of government. The judicial branch has completely it's abandoned its constitutional responsibility and duty. It's abandoned its role. It's given this role. It's just given it to the executive, or it's just given it to the legislative branch. It's just said, well, you have a prerogative. You can do whatever the hell you want. And so they have already thrown the Constitution under the bus, as is now being doubled down on by somewhat blaming the government's ineptitude to deliver land reform uh, they have to blame it on the Constitution, that it's a constitutional failing, when it's really just it's a power grab in order to find a way to vampire more resources uh, for a parasitic, parasitistic, uh, parasitistic uh, governmental um, structure uh, and form of politics, which is, I think, can be loosely called a crime against humanity. Um, but again, it's a special crime against humanity that is de facto endorsed by a large contingent of the electorate. And so we have to recognize that these people either don't understand the Constitution or they don't believe in the Constitution, and they are taken in by racialist politics, and they either endorse it or they are willing to tolerate it for other reasons. And if that is their way, we can't try to save the South African Constitution from people who don't believe in those values, who don't believe in non-racialism, who don't believe in the rule of law. You can't take them with you. And so in order to vindicate the supreme law in the Constitution, we have to call out some of our fellow citizens and say, well, I guess we can't live in the same country. We can't be part of the same political society because you live in a different in a different paradigm, and you live in an anti-constitutional paradigm, and you're not willing to vote in such a way to protect the Constitution, or to sustain it, even, um, or preserve it, conserve it. So I guess these people, they never valued the Constitution, and anyway, but so we do have to put these people on notice. We do have to make some kind of declaration, I think, that these things are necessary, that we need to have a functioning constitutional court again. We need to have the rule of law. We need to have a functioning judiciary that isn't just a kind of state ANC pedant that has been so institutionally weakened and corrupted that it's just there to facilitate and tolerate this excessive and vitriolic form of juvenile politics, which is so disgustingly racialist and oversimplified in its sort of moral this kind of morally confected diversionary outrage that it can use the power of the mob to seeming that it can pander to this very sort of basic set of sentiments of tribalism and racialism and racialist pride and this weird kind of social psychology to disguise all of its ineptitude and overt corruption and mismanagement. I mean, democracy has been, instead of being enhanced and developed, it has been diminished by the ANC government. And, the court does not have the independence to take any matter against it after it has bestowed it with the crown of governmental prerogative. So, already we have essentially a moot constitutional order which has been thoroughly betrayed and stabbed in the back by so-called constitutional judges who are effectively not constitutional judges. They are politically appointed vessels of maintaining a structure that can tolerate the ANC grift and the exacerbation of what I've already described as democratic illiteracy. But anyway, at the end of the day, an electorate must be accountable for the government that it elects. Otherwise, you don't live in a democracy. So even though I say that these people have actively subverted democracy, we still have to blame the electorate at the end of the day. You still have to blame the people at the end of the day, because if you don't blame them for their own government, for their own chosen government, you don't give them the basic dignity that they must be accorded, that they have the power to choose their government, and they have done so. And so we must direct our criticism at the electorate, but we can also say that this electorate, this large contingent of the electorate, is not evenly dispersed in every territory. And so there is some section of South Africa that can preserve the supreme law and can preserve the constitution and can vindicate and uphold it, and so that the revolution was not for nothing, and it can still be a beacon of hope and transformation, as in some sense what South Africa used to be, at least up until Mbeki was taken out. South Africa was a model for the rest of Africa, even, that you can put aside identity tribal politics and you could just get on with progressing and transforming and developing. And that essentially was somewhat eventually eclipsed and overrun by essentially enough racialist policy that the cracks in the mismanagement, sort of began to dictate the general trajectory of a downward spiral. Um, because we could have had better government. We always could have had better government. In some sense, the original crime of the at the beginning of the new South Africa was that we didn't have a longer government of national unity. If we had just had a longer government of national unity, at least then the people that ended up taking over the departments, the ministers and such, would have been more prepared and more entrained into those roles. They would have had more experience. There would have been less of a learning curve. And perhaps you could have said there would have been a longer period of time under which there was perhaps some check over corruption. And so let's say the cultural development of the institutional development of the corrupt apparatus within the ANC might have given way. Maybe it wouldn't have developed as badly. Maybe it would have been less destructive in its sort of, in some scale of nepotism and corruption. Maybe it would have been better disguised and more, and the system would have been more able to cope with that weight. But yeah. Anyway, there's no point in going in these counterfactual historical alternatives, but I do think it is correct that some territories of South Africa can say, we want our constitution back and we want it unbetrayed. We want it unfucked. We want it to be redeemed. We want it to be resurrected because it's been killed. It's been murdered. And the people that have murdered it is the politics of the ANC, the government of the ANC, and the electorate that has chosen the ANC. And these are people that we can actually disassociate from through the mechanism of a judicial revolution. Uh, and we have somewhat of a a practical necessity to engineer such. To reinstitute the supreme law and the constitutional order that needs to be resurrected, if nothing but an example for those who have sunk so low and pretend that these things have some kind of purchase, when they're really just very little window dressing and, in some sense, a disguise for a criminal organization that is committing a high crime against humanity. And I mean that not just in terms of the human cost, but in terms of the achievement that the constitutional order was in South Africa. That itself is a crime against humanity. I think it anyway, that's my general thesis, and I think that that is the most stable path to a solution, which will hopefully also create enough of a vector of discourse, and in some sense it's also a beautiful line of argument for sort of Cape independence, because it targets exactly the things that need to be targeted. It targets exactly the definition of what land mass, of what territory should be defined. It very, and in some sense then it can even extend itself to the rest of the territories. It can say, well, look, if you stop endorsing this kind of politics and this kind of government, and your electorate actually in a local territory change your voting pattern, then you can join the real South Africa, and you can rejoin the constitutional order. And we would like to extend this to you. We would like to grow the real South Africa into its true territory. But we can't take you if you essentially don't, if you stand with those who have betrayed the Constitution, and and who have installed institutional, that we need this kind of clarification in politics. We need this kind of demarcation, in some sense, this moral demarcation. Anyway, I'm expressing, I think, how it should manifest.